Well, the second season of Severance is out. No spoilers here, I promise. This time around, we're taking on a question that keeps popping up in Google searches. Could severance be possible in real life? As in, a microchip surgically inserted into your brain to keep your work and home personalities walled off from each other? Probably not. At least not yet. But the rest, the secrecy, the bizarre cult-like environments, and the sense of splitting yourself into work self and home self, that has absolutely happened. And it's not just a modern phenomenon. If you comb through the 20th century, you'll find episodes that feel eerily like something out of the show. I'm Almental, and this is my channel where we unravel the internet's strangest corners, swirl them around with technology, and serve it up with a dash of dystopian alarm. Today, we're mapping real-life counterparts to the unnerving world of Severance. Let's jump into that hair hole, because I've already finished with rabbit ones. First up, let's look at something that might seem tame at first glance, but was a huge step toward dehumanizing workers. The birth of Taylorism. Frederick Winslow, Taylor's so-called scientific management from the early 1900s, is known for slicing each work process into narrow, repetitive tasks, all in the name of maximum efficiency. Imagine you're in a steel mill, or perhaps on one of Henry Ford's revolutionary assembly lines, and you spend your entire shift fitting the same little piece onto the same spot on a conveyor belt, hour after hour, day after day. The system is lauded for boosting production and slashing costs, but from a human perspective, your identity is hardly relevant. Management doesn't need your creativity or your opinions, just your ability to keep up with the clock. A key piece of this was time motion studies, where you'd have a supervisor watching you work with a stopwatch in one hand and maybe a clipboard in the other, scribbling down every second, demanding you shave off a moment here or there. If you made a mistake or just got tired, someone else was always waiting in the wings to replace you. This might not be quite as psychologically jarring as having a chip in your head that toggles your consciousness, but think about it. Taylorism was the blueprint for turning the human worker into an interchangeable part, not all that different from the bolts and gears in the machine. And the older you got, or the more you slowed down, the more you felt that creeping anxiety. In a weird way, it mirrors the show's premise, a workplace that wants to sever the fuller dimensions of who you are so that only the productive side remains. No artistry, no personal flair, just follow the procedure. It laid the groundwork for a whole century of factories and offices that treat employees as cogs. One half of you is on the assembly line, the other half, the real you, maybe tries to stay alive outside those factory walls. Now, let's move to something more dramatic and definitely more hush-hush. The Manhattan Project. During World War II, the United States launched a massive effort to develop the first atomic bomb, fearful that Nazi Germany would get there first. This project was the pinnacle of top-down secrecy. Many of the people shipped off to remote sites like Los Alamos in New Mexico or Oak Ridge in Tennessee had no clue what they were truly building. Officially, Oak Ridge was so secret it didn't appear on maps, and new arrivals quickly discovered they had to keep their mouths shut, even around each other. If your job was installing pipes or wiring up a lab, you might suspect it was something war-related, but you wouldn't know the extent, because nobody told you. And you learned early on that asking questions got you nowhere. Oak Ridge, sometimes called the Secret City, ballooned to tens of thousands of workers almost overnight. There were armed guards, ID badges, constant monitoring of mail, and a culture where you just didn't talk. It was like living at your job, although some had the advantage of actual houses built on the site. And in a strangely Severance-like twist, you had entire neighborhoods brimming with people who only knew bits of their own tasks. Everyone else's duties were a mystery. This was exactly what the project directors wanted: compartmentalization to keep the bigger picture safely under wraps. Only when the Hiroshima bomb dropped did ordinary workers realize the scale of what they had contributed to. Some described it as a psychic shock. They'd been telling themselves it was just a job. Now they had to grapple with the reality that their labor had unleashed a weapon capable of annihilating cities. In a sense, they experienced a post-Severance meltdown. The moment they learned the truth, the identity they'd cultivated, just a regular worker doing his or her part, collided violently with this new revelation of what they had really done. The moral whiplash and guilt can't be overstated. Many wrestled with a pride versus horror dichotomy, and that is as close as it gets to the show's premise of discovering your work self might be doing something monstrous. No fancy memory block was involved, but secrecy can be just as effective a partition. Our next step along this axis of the real and disturbing is Foxconn. Think about a vast corporate campus, practically its own city. You eat, sleep, and work in the same complex, with thousands of others who rarely leave. This is the reality for many Foxconn employees in places like Shenzhen, China. Foxconn, one of the world's largest electronics manufacturers, has been known to impose grueling working conditions. You're assigned a dorm, you might eat in a cafeteria that's a short walk from the production lines, and your daily schedule is a relentless loop of repetitive tasks. In a sense, your work persona is never truly off duty because you never get the space to unwind. Everything about your environment screams, you are here to work. In 2010, a wave of worker suicides grabbed international headlines. The company responded by putting up nets around buildings to catch jumpers, which tells you all you need to know about how dire the situation was. People described a sense of suffocation, trapped in these endless production cycles, with minimal freedom to shape their personal lives. While no one forced a memory wipe on them, you could argue that when you can't leave and you have no real distinction between your personal space and your workplace, you lose that boundary anyway. It's an unsettling scenario that makes a lot of us cringe. The line between innie and outie in Severance might be defined by technology, but in Foxconn's dorms, it's more about physical constraints and social pressures. The effect can feel spookily similar. If you think corporate isolation is intense, wait until you hear about the Sea Org, Scientology's elite unit. The Church of Scientology has a long history of controlling and isolating its members, but Sea Org is the ultimate expression of that. Members sign a contract for 1 billion years, a symbolic commitment that's meant to span multiple lifetimes. They live in communal facilities, sometimes on cruise ships in the earlier decades, cut off from much of the outside world. Communication is heavily monitored. You can be punished for stepping out of line or even showing doubt. Critics have called it a cult for good reason. Some ex-members describe the experience as losing touch with who they were before Sea Org. Others say they felt like children, constantly being corrected and disciplined, as if personal autonomy was a privilege they'd surrendered upon joining. It doesn't take an implant in your brain to warp your sense of identity when your entire environment is closed off and everything you see or do is regulated. Some watchers of Severance liken the macrodata refinement floor to a cult compound, and if that's the vibe you got from the show, Sea Org is basically the real-world manifestation, minus the crisp white halls and stylish overhead lights. Instead, think cramped bunks and mandatory courses on L. Ron Hubbard's doctrines. Before we get to the grand finale of CIA brain meddling, let's talk about another phenomenon that tilts dangerously close to psychological horror: Karoshi, or death by overwork in Japan. One of the most notorious modern cases took place at the advertising giant Dentsu. Matsuri Takahashi, a young employee, took her own life in 2015 after months of crushing overtime and little sleep. The post-incident investigations exposed a culture where employees felt immense pressure to stay longer, work harder, and never show weakness. In some ways, it's the ultimate voluntary severance. Your personal life becomes an afterthought, pushed aside by your corporate identity. You might still have your memories, but they do you no good when the company norm is to sacrifice your well-being for the collective goals. The guilt of leaving early, the fear of being labeled a slacker, the constant internal dialogue that says you should be working, these pressures can sever you from normal human rhythms just as effectively as any microchip. Finally, we have arrived at the creepiest real-life parallel of all, Project MK Ultra. This was the CIA's sprawling attempt starting in the early 1950s to figure out how to control and maybe even erase a person's mind. If that doesn't make your spine tingle, consider what it meant. Unsuspecting citizens were dosed with LSD, forcibly kept awake for days, subjected to intense sensory deprivation, or psychologically manipulated in ways that still boggle the imagination. The goal was to break down someone's identity, see if it could be reprogrammed, then build them back up as a tool, an asset for espionage, or maybe something more nefarious. Some of the victims never even knew they were involved in such an experiment until years later, if they ever found out at all. The notion that a government agency would do this on home soil, often without informed consent, is enough to make you question how far authorities will go. In essence, MK Ultra wasn't about a neat, stylish procedure that flips you from innie to outie. It was messy, unethical, and in many cases devastating, leaving subjects with severe trauma or long-term mental health issues. It's basically the real-life manifestation of Severance gone wrong, a ham-handed attempt to pry open someone's mind and see how it ticks. And that's why it stands out as the most disturbing example we've got. So we've charted a journey from factory floors to secret desert installations, from corporate dormitories to the high seas enclaves of a religious organization, all the way to a clandestine government program that tried to hack the human psyche. It's not fiction, it's history. The big question remains, how close are we truly to the world depicted in Severance? If you're talking about a literal microchip, we might still be a few leaps of technology and ethical meltdown away, but the line between personal and professional self has always been a little fuzzy, and under the right conditions, it can vanish. Some say that future workplace tech, like augmented reality or neural implants, could accelerate that process. We might willingly hand over more control of our mental state if it gets us a competitive edge, or maybe we'll see more crises like the Foxconn and the Dentsu case, horrible reminders that the old-fashioned ways of severing identity through relentless overwork and suffocating isolation are still very much with us. Even if we never get to severance-level technology, we can inadvertently create the same effect, a workforce that leaves its soul at the door. You might be thinking, but relax, you can't change anything. To an extent, that's true. These historical events teach us that massive secrecy or psychological manipulation can be carried out by governments, corporations, or cults under the right conditions. By the time the public catches on, the damage is often already done. Then again, history also shows us that exposure and whistleblowing can trigger reforms, investigations, and in the best cases, accountability. After revelations of MKUltra, congressional hearings led to partial reforms and laws about ethical standards in research, though we still wonder how much remains in the shadows. After the tragedies at Foxconn, the world demanded improvements, and conditions did see some incremental changes. After the Dentsu scandal, Japan had a national conversation on work culture and labor laws, leading to some attempts at limiting overtime. But this is not the end. Don't get your hopes up. Even as one extreme recedes, a new one can arise. Maybe it'll come from AI-run workplaces or from brand new corporate compounds that look more like futuristic cities than factories. Maybe it'll involve personalized VR settings that reduce your job to a gamified environment, or maybe entire nations will deploy advanced psychological tactics to keep populations in line. The point is, the potential for severance-like conditions isn't going anywhere. It's just evolving along with our technologies and social systems. At least in Severance, the employees exist in a slick, fictional office building with clearly defined innie and outie identities. In real life, the dividing line can be subtler and even more disorienting because it happens through policy, culture, or mental conditioning, not a fancy memory filter.
Now that is post-irony!
But perhaps the biggest irony is that some people might welcome such a device if it means leaving the stress of work behind when you clock out. The question is whether we'd sacrifice a piece of our humanity for that convenient partition. And let's be honest, humanity has a long history of giving up personal freedoms in exchange for a sense of security or comfort. Anyway, this is Al Mental, signing off. If your workplace starts looking a little too much like a sealed corridor with mindless tasks and a stifling sense of isolation, maybe it's time to ask tough questions. Or maybe you'll just shrug and say, everybody's got brain rot these days, might as well join the club, because either we adapt and survive, or we risk being unemployed when the robots finally rise. One day, the biggest decision might be whether to plug into the corporate severance system or wander the jobless wilderness outside. That's our future for you. Pick your dystopia, because apparently we've got plenty of options. Stay sharp, folks, and remember, history's lessons are only useless if we ignore them. Keep your eyes open, and your identity, well, keep it as intact as possible. Good luck out there.